Hey everyone, this is Tom. I'm just going to give an overview of how to use a mixer. First, we're just going to go over what all is on it and what everything is, all the terminology, and then I'll show you how to use it. So this is our shiny new Allen Heath Z18 mixer. It is a pretty standard mixer, so most of the things that I show you should work on other mixers as well. Now there's pretty much two priorities when it comes to running everything through the mixer. The first priority is to get everything that's coming in here through the input channels to the output section. So in here comes all the mics, they come into the system, and here they go out to the speakers or whatever you have. Priority number two is making that actually sound good. So under all of our inputs, we have all the controls that control each individual input. And to the right, we have all the controls that control all the outputs. Now first, let's start with some very general terminology. These are some words that you'll commonly hear. Now when people say fader, they're referring to the sliders at the bottom of the mixer. Each of the knobs that you see is called a potentiometer. You will see people use the word pot for short. A bus is the word used to refer to each of your main outs. We call this a 6-bus mixer. It has 2 main buses and 4 auxiliary buses. The input channels are mixed onto each of these separate buses and then sent out. So for vocabulary, we'll start at the top and just work our way down. So at the top of the mixer are the mic and the line inputs, and under those you will see all the controls for a given channel. Now this line of controls is called a channel strip. It contains all the controls relevant to that one channel. Under the inputs you'll see the insert jack. And the insert jack is a special kind of jack that has both the send and receive on the same jack. So you can use this to put other items like a gate, limiter, compressor in the same line as a channel strip. These will add even more elements of control to that single input. So with this you'll be adding even more controls to this channel strip. So as your signal's coming in through the mic or the line input, the first thing that it hits is the preamp. Preamp is short for preamplifier. It literally means the amplifier before your main amplifier. It's used to get the signal that's coming in through the mic or the line input up to the right level. And under the preamp you'll see the EQ or equalizer section. So in this section we'll usually see high frequency or a treble, mid frequency, and low frequency or bass. These will give you control over shaping your sound. Do you want a lot of high pitches or a lot of low pitches? And over the EQ section you'll see a filter. This filter uses 100 Hz as its reference frequency. You usually use this as an onstage pop filter, so it'll take out the harsh sounds of your P's or D's or any other percussive sounds that somebody's mouth can make. Under the EQ section you generally have your auxiliary sends section. So these are more outputs that you can use depending on if you want different outputs to have a different mix. And generally at the bottom of the channel strip is the pan knob. If you have a stereo mix, you will use this to control which side your channel is going to. And next up is your self-explanatory mute button. Right under the mute button on this mixer is the peak indicator light. This will tell you if your signal is too loud and is punching the top of your max volume. Some mixers will also have a signal light, and this will tell you if the signal coming in through the channel is strong enough. Under the mute button is something called the PFL. The PFL stands for pre-fade listen, and you generally use that in metering, figuring out what your channel is doing before it hits the outputs. And the last thing on the channel strip will be the fader. This is your volume control. So that's basically it for the input section. Now let's move to the output section. The first thing to talk about are your main outs. Usually along with those are your auxiliary outs. Then of course at the bottom you will generally have your main out control. This is built as a stereo mixer, so there are 2 faders at the far right end of this. This is your everything volume control. And above that are your auxiliary main controls. These work just like the sliders at the bottom, except they just control the auxiliary channels. And the entire section above this is the metering section. It's generally located here on pretty much every mixer. So you'll have both auditory metering and visual metering. For the visual metering you have usually a series of LED lights or anything to give you an idea of what your signal is doing. And for your auditory metering, you'll generally have headphones or any kind of monitor output. Most mixers are equipped with 48-volt phantom power. Phantom power is generally used to power condenser microphones, which need their own separate power source. In a live setting, there is almost always no reason to use phantom power. So as a general rule, leave it off. So now we'll start on how to use all this stuff. The first thing to learn how to do is how to use the preamp. If you've used a mixer before, you may have realized that there's kind of two volume controls for each channel. You have the preamp at the very top, which usually says gain on it, and at the bottom you have the fader. The reality is that the fader is actually supposed to be the true volume control for the channel. The preamp is what you use to make sure that the signal coming in is strong enough before it hits any of the other circuitry. So ideally, if we're using a big number of channels, each channel should actually be at the same volume by the time it reaches the fader. The thing is, different microphones, different instruments, different components that get plugged into the mixer all run at different levels. So we use the preamp to balance this out. Generally, we'll have to turn up microphones quite a bit. So we're going to use the preamp at the first stage to get everything up to that 0 decibel ideal signal level. And the easiest way to do that on a mixer like this would be to use the PFL, the pre-fade listen button. So what I'm going to do is just show you how to use it using one of our wireless mics. You will want to start with your gain all the way down, and then for that given channel, hit the PFL button, and you're ready to start looking at the metering section. When I hit that PFL button, that means that this metering section all the way to the right is now listening to only this channel. So if this light's on, which is our PFL indicator, which most mixers have, that means that this metering section is only going to show this channel. And the level that it's going to show us is pre-fader, so it's not going to matter what level your fader is at. Whatever's coming through before that fader is going to come out right here, both to the headphone jack and to the visual metering. Now on this mixer, it won't matter whether or not the mute button is on or off. The signal will be sent to the PFL. So now we're going to make sure that our microphone is on and plugged in correctly. Now we're going to talk into the mic and give it a signal as we turn this up, and we're going to see what our metering tells us. Check, 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 check. When we start getting a signal that's close to that 0 decibel level, we'll know that we've reached the right level. Now in instances where you have that signal indicator light, you can just use that. And when you get a solid green light, you'll know you've reached the right level. On some cheaper mixers, however, you might not have any visual metering, so you will have to do everything by ear, which more or less might be guesswork. The easiest way to tell if you've turned it up too much is if your peak light is flashing. Then you'll know just to turn your preamp down. Now when we've turned all of our PFLs off, the signal that is sent to the meter will be our main left and right. This is true for most mixers. Now we'll go over the EQ section. So in order to show you how this works, I decided to plug my mic into channel 4, and we'll mess with these controls to see what it does. So let's see what only the high frequencies sound like. So with this setting, my voice probably sounds pretty tinny. Lots of clarity, but not really any body. Now if we turn up the mid section, my voice has a lot of body, but not really any clarity. And for the low section, I probably sound underwater. There's not much bass in my voice. Different channels you might want to EQ differently. Like if you have a singer, you want their voices cutting through and being the main thing heard over the mix, so you might turn up the high frequencies and have them cut through the mix. But then for your instruments, you might want them to move the mix. They won't shine through, but they'll move it if you turn up the low frequencies. In some mixes, you'll have too much body, in which case you'll lose clarity, and the channel might be very loud, but somehow not be very audible. So you might want to do something we call cutting the mids, which will give the channel a great clarity, but still preserve some of its body. Other than that, there's not much more I can say except train your ears. Get to know what sounds good. Now for the auxiliary section. There's not much more to say than that they're all different volume controls. So you can treat them all just like the faders, except they will go to different outputs. Where it gets complicated is in the fact that many mixers are set up in very different ways. On this mixer, Auxiliary 1 and Auxiliary 2 are pre-fader. Generally, when you see the word pre or post on your mixer, it means pre-fader or post-fader. So auxiliary 1 happens before the fader. So it will take everything in the channel strip all the way down, and the signal will come out here. For our auxiliary 3 and auxiliary 4, it says post fader. This means that the signal will go all the way down, and the auxiliary channel will even take into account what level the fader is set at. So if I turn this up or down, it's affecting this. The auxiliary channels will also vary mixer to mixer on how their outputs are set up. On this mixer, auxiliary 1 and auxiliary 2 are controlled by these two pots all the way to the right. Auxiliary 3 and auxiliary 4 have no main control pots. Whatever you're selecting on each channel's output will go straight to auxiliary 3 or auxiliary 4 output with no additional controls. Something that you will use the auxiliary channels for is setting up a monitor. You will set up a monitor so that your musicians or speakers can hear themselves, and lots of times that mix will be different than your main mix coming out of the big speakers. So for this, you will just plug in whatever monitor, speaker you have facing your musicians into the auxiliary output channel. And then you'll just have to keep in mind all of your auxiliary channel controls. And post-fader auxiliary channels can be used to set up effects loops. There are many different ways to do this, but a simple way will be to go out of your auxiliary output and back into another channel. So in this application, we can run out of the auxiliary 3 channel, and we will run this cable to any outside effects that we want. So if we have an effects pedal like a reverb or a chorus, we can run this cable out. And we can use another cable to run that back into any channel that we want. So we could just use the monaural setting on the stereo 4 channel. And for each individual channel, we would control the effects level by controlling our auxiliary 3 send. And our stereo 4 channel would be controlling how much of that effects loop comes through to the main mix. Now when it comes to mixing different channels together, you'll have to train your ears. In a music setting, your first priority will be to make sure that whoever is leading is leading. So make sure that their voice and their instrument, if they're playing one, is loud enough and that it's cutting through the mix. After that, you can worry about saturating the mix, filling in the low end, and letting the other musicians come through. And one general rule with mixing sound is that your ears have the final say. So you'll have to train them to hear what can be improved, what can be clearer, and how to change things to make it easier to listen to. Another thing that you will have to note is your monitoring location. Many times your sound room might not have the most accurate representation of what's actually coming over those main speakers and what most people are actually hearing. So you may have to go out for a walk and go and listen to what your actual listeners are hearing. Sometimes when it sounded like you needed more bass from your sound room, it turns out that your crowd was already being overloaded with it. So always have the end product in mind. So that's pretty much it on the basics. As a final note, read your manual. There's a lot of nuances to each individual mixer that you'll probably have to know as you're using it. And finally, make sure you get plenty of practice. There's a number of things like managing feedback, learning how to work quickly when you have a problem, that you're only going to get over time.